So, I say this every time. I've now completed, I think, 8 sessions of the Hartman Ethics with the morning class, and now this is the second one with the evening class. And I think I say this every single time that I teach it, is I'm really happy with this Hartman curriculum. I think it's fantastic, and I love teaching text. But I also very often, every week, they have a theme, and they choose certain examples to speak about the theme. And I wonder, why did they choose this text and not a different text? And maybe I wouldn't have chosen this text, or do these texts actually illustrate the point that they're trying to make? So, I tonight, having said that, it's sort of the topic tonight is covenantal ethics. What is it that we owe to our own community? And in the eyes of the tradition, that means the Jewish community. That specifically means the Jewish community. And last week we talked about universal ethics, that what we owe to other human beings by virtue of the fact that they were created in the image of God, and therefore we owe them something. But what does that mean that we owe specifically to Jews? And I was thinking about this in light of an email that I sent out to the congregation about supporting Masorti Olami. So if you read that email, which I hope you did, it's gone out twice. It's funds for the worldwide conservative movement for their emergency fund to help the Jews of the Ukraine. I just read one of their initial reports. They're cleaning it up and putting pictures, and hopefully I'll send it out later in the week. But they are bringing Jews from the conservative movement, finding them housing, finding them, shelter, getting them food, getting them connected with conservative synagogues and communities in Hungary and in Berlin, and then also working to arrange flights for those that want to come to Israel. So this is really specific, right? This is really specific. When we think about helping Ukrainians, and then we think about helping Jews, and then we think about helping conservative Jews, like, it's sort of like you're now, conservative Jews who I've met, I mean, it's not that, it's like, how specific, and what are your obligations, particularly when resources are limited, particularly when going into this that you can't help everybody. How do you sort of determine, or how does our tradition determine what you do, and how you decide to allocate the resources that you have, when it would be wonderful if you had, I don't know, if you were, I don't know, Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, and you could help, a gazillion people, and I don't think they are, but they could. Or if you're just a normal human being who has to make choices about resources. And frankly, this is really not only true for individuals, it's true really for governments too. How do you decide? And there's been a big debate in Israel. It's been a painful debate about, do you take in Ukrainian refugees? Do you take in Ukrainian refugees that aren't Jewish? Do you take in Ukrainian refugees that aren't Jewish but have family members that are Jewish that live in Israel? Or do you take in only Jews, or by the law of return, a person that has one Jewish grandparent? And how do you determine that in a country that's small and doesn't have unlimited resources? So, we're living with these very life and death questions that governments make, and that people have to make. Right now it feels pretty immediate, and it feels at like every single day that we're thinking about this. So the question is really, what does our tradition have to say about this? There's I don't know how to say this in Yiddish. I don't speak Yiddish. I grew up with 4 American-born grandparents, and one grandmother was from Hungary, where they didn't speak Yiddish. So I didn't grow up with Yiddish, Rami. So if any of you grew up speaking Yiddish or know Yiddish, maybe you know how to say this joke in Yiddish, and then you can share it. But it basically goes like, or it's a Yiddish curse, actually, it's a Yiddish curse. May you have a lot of money and be the only one in your family that has it. So, and I'm sure it sounds much, anybody know that in Yiddish? Anybody? No? Okay. This is what's lost after all these generations. So,
I know Yiddish. I can speak Yiddish.
do you know
Uh,
that curse?
huh?
Do you know
Rose.
that curse?
I've never heard the expression, but I can translate it. Das haben a Sachgeld und sein der einzige Mensch in Haus, wo hat Geld.
See,
Oh
it
my
sounds
God,
so
I
much
haven't
better in
spoken in
Yiddish.
so long.
Right. It sounds much better in Yiddish, right? Like, if you're the only one in your family that has money, guess what? Everybody's going to be coming to you. So here's what the Torah has to say about that. If there be among you a needy person, one of your kin, within any of your dwelling places in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your needy kin. So let's just stop for a second and say, what's the phrase, besides the fact you have to give, what's the phrase that jumps out? What should you not do? Okay, so here Kate mouthing, harden your heart. Who hardens his heart? Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh. And when Moses during the plagues is trying to get the Israelites out of Egypt, every time there's a plague and Pharaoh says he's going to let the people go, and then he hardens his heart. He changes his mind. He hardens his heart. And so what this text is telling us, if you have needy people in your land, don't be like Pharaoh, right? Don't be like the Egyptians. Don't be like the people that enslaved people. Don't be like the people that took advantage of people that were vulnerable. Give. You have to give. If this is not only, it says kinsman, but it also says anywhere in your land. Right? So anywhere in your land, anybody is in need, you have to give. Now the Torah in the land, it says in the land that God is going to show you. And of course, that means Israel. Now the word in Hebrew, they translate it as one of your kin. The word in Hebrew is achicha, which translates as your brother. If one of your brothers, but it actually in the Torah doesn't literally mean your biological brother. When the Torah uses the word brother, that's why they translated it as kinsman, your brother, your fellow citizen, one who's like you. I don't know if this is still true, but in the olden days, in my youth, one of the ways that Israeli soldiers referred to each other was ach, was brother. I mean, we might say bro, right? Maybe there was a certain time in American culture that you'd call somebody bro, even though it wasn't your biological brother. It was a sense of connection, right? It's a connection. And probably for the Black community that started with that slang of bro, it actually was the same sort of thing. You're more than just a person or a stranger. We have a connection. There's something that binds us. And certainly that's supposed to be very true in the Jewish community. This is sort of an aside. I say to some people, I still read the New York Times. I know that it's a struggle sometimes. It is a bit ideologically to the left on certain things that I don't agree with them about. And one of, in my mind, the most I think anti-Semitic writers of the New York Times is a man by the name of Patrick Kingsley. And when he writes about Israel, he doesn't call it Israel. He calls it the Israeli state, which I think is anti-Semitic, frankly. We don't say the German state or the French state. It actually reminds me a lot of calling it the Zionist entity, which is how the Arab community referred to Israel for a very, very long time. However, today he wrote the most touching article about Israel. I was really shocked. about Israelis who are going back. The name of the town, they mentioned the name of the town that it's called today, and I didn't recognize the name. It's in Polish. I didn't recognize the name of the town, but it's talking about Israelis whose families left there 100 years ago to flee, to make their way to Palestine, are now making their way back to Poland to help these Jewish refugees and help get them to Israel. And a few paragraphs in, it says the name of the town used to be called in the Jewish community Kishinev. And if you hear that and you know anything about the Jewish history of the Ukraine, it's just sort of send chills through your body, because in the early 1900s, there was a terrible pogrom in Kishinev. Chaim Nachman Bialik wrote about it in an epic poem called The City of Slaughter. And it spurred a lot of young Jews to leave that area and to make their way to Israel. And so these Israelis talk about this sense of 100 years, like they didn't even personally know their relatives that left Kishinev. It was their, great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, but talked about the sense of meaning and closure to go back to this place, a place where Jews could only flee, where nobody wanted to help them. And other than, Palestine, they had really nowhere to go. Soon after this, the doors of the United States was closing. And to be able to go there and help these people, I cry, every time I think about it, I start to cry, but to help these people, right, this sense of obligation to help these people. And in this case, people that actually, were not only Jews, but were from the town, that your great-grandparents or your great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents would be. So that's what these texts are sort of underpinning, is this idea that you shouldn't harden your heart, that a lot of the Torah, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in not so subtle ways, a lot of the message of the Torah is don't be like the Egyptians, right? Love the stranger because you were a stranger. A society, the Egyptian society, that built these large tombs to commemorate their dead, and Moses dies and we don't know where he was buried, right? There's a lot of that one's probably more subtle, but there's this constant juxtaposition about Egypt was an evil society that oppressed and abused the helpless. You may not create a society like that. You have obligations. It's tempting to, put on blinders, walk down the street and not hear, but it's a violation of the Torah. So you shall surely open your hand to them and lend them sufficient for their need. Interesting, it says lend, right? Like you're not obligated. You're obligated to give tzedakah, but you're also obligated to help people and expect that it's a loan and that it could be paid back. Open your hands to them. Beware lest there be a base thought in your heart saying, the seventh year, the year of remission, is at hand. All right, so let's just explain what that is. In the Jewish tradition, you can't buy land in perpetuity, and people can become indentured servants. Jews, other Jews, Israelites, can become indentured servants, but they need to be freed in the seventh year. So it actually changed land value, right? If you're buying land in the seventh, in the first year, or in the sixth year, it was, it was more like a long-term rent situation and or a short-term rent situation. So you could say, I'm going to loan you this money, but you're going to pay me back. But it's only a few months to the seventh year, and this is going to like wipe the slate clean, and I'm never going to get my money back. And so you may be tempted to not want to help because you're going to be tempted that the money's not going to come back to you. So beware lest there be a base thought and you be evil to your needy kin and give them nothing. And then they cry out to the Lord against you and guilt comes upon you. Throughout the Torah, over and over, the idea that God is listening and God is watching and God cares about the vulnerable in society. Remember, Pharaoh says, I know not this God, right? Moses says, God says, Adonai says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I don't know this God. Pharaoh thinks of himself as a god. The Egyptian people think of himself as a god. He's a god that doesn't care, right? He's a god that uses people for his own wealth and for his own purposes. Not so the God of the Torah. The God of the Torah is on the side of the needy, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, those that are the most vulnerable in society. And God is watching and listening. And if you act this way, God is going to know. And then you'll be guilty. You shall surely give them, and you shall not be discontented in your giving to them, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all of your actions, of all of your undertakings. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall surely open your hand to the poor and needy kin in your land. So this is always going to be a problem. You're never going to reach a utopian society, as much as there have been societies that have tried. You're never going to reach that society, and therefore you have an obligation. One of the other phrases that you might hear repeated in this, which is, and you shall open your hand. Anybody familiar, remember the old days? We used to do this more often in person. We don't even actually do this prayer so often in person anymore. A liturgical piece that says, Poteach et yadecha umaspia l'kol chai ratzon. That is from the Ashrei. Remember the Ashrei? We used to sing it responsibly. We're talking about God. God is the one that opens his hand. We'll say his because it's just easier, it flows. God opens God's hand and feeds the hungry. Poteach et yadecha. And so if we are created in the image of God, as we talked about last week, then as God opens God's hand to feed the hungry, so too the Torah tells us that our obligation is to open our hand, and it's repeated several times, to open our hands to the needy. Think about this, right? The person that, clasps their hands, holds on to their wealth, holds on. You're not allowed to be a person like that. You're a person of generosity that has your hands, wide, should have your hands wide open. So let's just stop there for a minute. Anybody want to say anything, add anything, ask anything?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I notice it's all in the singular. The you is all singular. So I think it's commanding each person individually, because I think if it's collective, if they were using the chem, then people might think, oh, it's referring to somebody else.
Right. He'll talk. My neighbor will take care. It's all of us. They'll take care of it. So that, because the Torah does go in and out of speaking to you to the people as a collective, and speaking to the people as if they're speaking to an individual. So Maris noticed in the Hebrew that it's the singular, right? You, not yes, all of you, but you are responsible for this. You have a responsibility for this. So, you can't be like, well, if everybody, what is that? What was that? Was it stone? No, I don't know. What was the thing about everybody? It was like a kid's story where everybody took a little bit, or everybody thought everybody else was putting into the pot. So it's like, because everybody else will put in, they won't notice that I didn't put in. And in the end, all they had was like a pot of water, because everybody else assumed, that if everybody else is doing it, nobody will notice that I'm not, right? So you can't hide behind, not allowed to hide behind that. And then, it starts out by saying, the other thing that people notice too is that if there be a needy person amongst you, right? That's how the passage starts. If there be, and then it ends, they'll never cease. So the if they'll be is sort of this utopian, like if you really live correctly, there'll never be poor people in your land. And then, of course, the recognition that, of course, there will be. And, the one thing that, and I teach this constantly, I don't think I have to tell this group, but I certainly have had to over the years. If you ask people, how do you, what is the definition of tzedakah? That many people will say the definition is charity. Because what we know of tzedakah is giving money to people or to causes. And in English, that's called charity. But of course, in Hebrew, the word tzedakah means tzedek, or righteousness. And you give because it's the right thing to do, or you give because you're creating a just and righteous society. And as I often say, you don't have to do a show of hands. Would you rather be if you don't think there's a difference, would you rather be the recipient of charity, or would you rather be the recipient of justice? And everybody said, I'd rather get what I get because it's the just and right thing. If you're in need, of course, you would want charity, but it's a different sense, right? Charity is something that somebody gives you out of the goodness of their heart, and you're needy and you're not on equal footing. The recipient is an unequal footing with the giver. Whereas if you're the receiver of justice, the giver and the receiver are on equal footing. This is just a fixing and a righting to make right what society ideally is supposed to be like, but isn't the way it's supposed to be. So giving tzedakah is making the world more the way it's supposed to be. So that's that again is a bit of a different concept in our tradition. But that is not the only thing, interestingly enough, if we are trying to create a world of covenant. First of all, let's talk about what that means for a moment. Let's stop and talk about what that means. Normally, when we talk about covenant, it's the idea that the Jewish people are in a covenant with God. What is the Brit Milah? Since we just celebrated one in my family. What is a Brit Milah mark? I mean, what
covenant?
It's the covenant, right? It's the covenant between the Jewish people and God that we mark in the organ that is responsible, the male organ that's responsible for procreation. So it's quite the statement, right? The very organ, I mean, obviously women are part of this too, but this very organ that can be used both for bad and good in the world is marked as something that is the sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And so our covenantal relationship is with God. But because we are part of the Jewish people, we also have a covenantal relationship with each other. We're all part of the deal, right? We're all part of the society that has become part of the covenant. So then the question is what do we owe each other? So one thing that we owe each other is to take care of those that are in need. That's probably fairly obvious. If I hadn't showed you one Torah source and I said to you, what do you owe the other people of the covenant? You probably really quickly would have gotten to taking care of them, right? If they're in need, if they need something, we take care of them. I wish somebody had done this for me when I had a new baby, but Shai and Sahar are part of the Rose Crown Minyan community at Anshe Emet, which is an amazing community. And as soon as the baby was born, their community set up a meal train for them. And so 3 times a week for 3 months, somebody, some people from out of the Rose Crown community, some of our good friends, other good friends that they have, but mostly their community is bringing them meals 3 times a week. I kind of thought as a grandmother, somebody should send me a meal. Like I've been really extra helpful. I could, well, actually, very good friends that are on this call, we glommed onto their meal and invited us when they took a meal to Shai and Sahar. The Horowitzes took a meal to Shai and Sahar. We're like, can we come too? So I did glom on to one meal. But we see, and this is something I think that we've lost a bit in the liberal movements of Judaism. In the Orthodox community, people are much more attuned to taking care of their community members that are in need. If you walk into an Orthodox synagogue on Shabbat afternoon, pre-COVID, chances are somebody will come up to you and say, do you have a place to go for lunch? That's, that there's a different sense of responsibility of taking care of each other. And I think we've lost that, which is really a shame. I think the larger community has lost that too. I don't think it's just the Jewish community in the United States. I think people that used to live in small towns or were in, the same school community or whatever it was, I think had more of a sense of how they took care of one another. So that one is obvious. But what else do you owe the people around you that are part of the covenant? So this is a hard one. You shall not hate your fellow in your heart, You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of them. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against your fellow citizens. Rather, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So everybody is probably, I hope, very familiar with you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? Ani Adonai, right? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am God, right? The sentence didn't have to end that way. The verse could have ended, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, period. Next topic. But again, this connection with how we treat each other, it has something to do with our relationship with God. But what you might not have known is the verse that precedes you shall love your neighbor talks about you shall not hate your fellow in your heart. And this is tough. How do you not hate your neighbor? How do you not hate your neighbor? The verse says you shall rebuke them. So what do you think that means?
It means don't hold it in. It means if there's an issue, bring it out in the open.
Yeah, I think they're better at this in Israel. I think American Jews, you don't hold it in. If something's bothering you, if your neighbor, your friend, your family member has done something that bothers you, don't hold it in. I think it actually goes even a little farther than that. If they do something that you think is bad or dangerous, you need to tell them. Lisa?
Yeah, that's such a tough one in the past. I've just had a personal experience with a neighbor in the past 5 years who's actually, it's sort of come out that they're sort of anti-Semitic and racist.
Oy.
So like, how do you rebuke a neighbor about, and they're with no awareness of it, right? It's just
Right.
like Trump era kind of shed a light on these people. And it's like, that's such a tough one of rebuke. That's so interesting.
Right.
But I have made an effort to stay in contact with them as a personal challenge, to be in contact with people who don't think the same way I do. But I can't imagine actually ever confronting them about their, I don't know, racism or even anti-Semitism is a tough one for me.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like part of like this comes with a warning, like, don't try this at home. I think it's really, I mean, it's interesting that the Torah had a different vision of society. It had clearly a different idea about what people could or couldn't say to one another. I do think in Israel, I've never asked an Israeli this. I should do a little research and ask Israelis this. Israelis tend to be more blunt about what they're thinking and feeling and saying. I remember when I was in college, I spent my junior year in Israel, and one of my Israeli neighbors in the dorm said to me, "Oh, you have a pimple on your nose." So it's like, you know what? First of all, I know I have a pimple on my nose. I can see it in the mirror. Second of all, why are you saying, like, did you think this is helpful? To her, it was just matter of fact. I have it. She sees it. She's telling me. And I don't know, I'm a Midwesterner. So I was like, like we just pretend people don't. We just look at their cheek. We don't look at their nose, and we don't talk about it. Now that wasn't like she was helping me. If she said you have a pimple on your nose and I have pimple cream, like that might have been a more helpful piece of information. Donna, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I was. I'm on it, that at work, I'm on a leadership team, and we're not the most functional leadership team, let's put it that way. And I was talking to my boss today, and what happens is nobody will speak up when they disagree, and that's why we're so dysfunctional. If people would say, they just nod and look like they agree and then walk off and don't do it.
Wow.
And it would be so much easier if people would speak up and say what they're thinking.
Right.
And we'd be much more functional.
Right. Yeah, but I also learned something for you that I've struggled with. I've struggled with professionally. I've struggled with in my volunteer work. But Donna, who's spent her career in human resources and has a PhD, and said to me, feedback is a gift. Feedback is what allows you to grow. But many of us, whether it's in the workplace or whether, as I said, I've had it even in my volunteer, it's not easy. to hear it. And people don't always know how to give it in a way that allows the person to hear it and to grow. And so maybe, I don't know, when the rebuke is a strong term, like rebuke is a very strong term. But I think a lot, it's for me, it's a challenge. It was particularly a challenge when I was a young rabbi, because sometimes I felt the feedback was very unfair. You know, how do you hear it? And I have to say, one of the things that I learned, like, okay, I'll just tell you something that happened when I was a young rabbi. After Rabbi Frankel retired, one of the presidents called me in a couple weeks before Rosh Hashanah and said, you know, a lot of people don't like your sermons, your high holiday sermons. So I was like, okay, I could do better. But I learned to say, as I got a little older and a little more mature, if I got that kind of feedback, which is, okay, so tell me what it is you want me to learn from this. Like, what is it that you want me to take away so that I can improve? As opposed to saying, why would you think that that was in the least bit helpful? And that was really hurtful. And now I've got to get up in front of all these people knowing that, like, people don't like my sermons. And besides, I think they do. But to say, like, you know, how, but, you know, listen, I mean, let's just talk about, I don't know, vaccines. Has anybody, Deanna is the only one I know on this call who has had people that did not want to take a vaccine, that she convinced. What are you making hamantash? What are you doing over there, Deanna? So you didn't rebuke, but you want to say something about how maybe you got some of your patients to change their mind about something they.
Sure. I did not rebuke any of them because that would not have worked at all. And by the way, yes, I am making hamantaschen.
Oh, yummy.
Out of.
Out of Fimo for a little, they're not yummy, don't eat these, out of Fimo for a preschool class.
Oh.
So, however, what I did is I listened first. I started by saying, first of all, oh my gosh, I had to start by saying, I'm not trying to change your mind. And I'm curious. I'm not judging you, because otherwise, you know, you lose your audience instantly. But I just asked them, what is it I'm curious, it's available. What is it that you're hesitant about? Why is it that you don't want this? And then each person would tell me their answer, and I'd have to be incredibly I have to be very, very patient, which for some of you who know me, that's a little bit hard sometimes, especially when I think you're saying things that are totally wrong. But then I would just address the question of, you know, like one of them would say, well, I want to get pregnant and I've heard it, you know, it could cause infertility. So I would explain it to her that, no, that's false. I would show her where the information came from. And she'd say, oh, really? Well, can you sign me up for a shot? And all of them were that easy. But yeah, the ones I got, it was just listening and patience. And sometimes it took weeks or even months to convince them. Although I will say that from July through January, we were very successful in convincing people. That tap has slowed completely. So, but that's not why I was raising my hand.
Okay, go ahead.
I was raising my hand because Rebecca is interviewing or trying to interview for summer internships. And one of the jobs had a really interesting digital remote interview process. And one of it was an hour-long test asking exactly about what you were talking about, I think it was Donna that just said that people don't disagree with each other. And they started by saying, one of the questions was, is it important for you to be loyal to your boss? And we had a whole long conversation, partially because she didn't know how long this test was going to be. And I said, loyal seems like not a good word. Loyal seems like I'm going to stand by you, even if I really disagree, and I will, you know. But by the time they were done, what they really were trying to find out is, are you willing to speak up? I mean, it turned out there were like 8 or 10 questions about it. Would you support your boss even if you disagreed with them? Do you have any problems telling your boss they're wrong? And I think that it goes to what you say, that in a healthy personal or work environment or neighbor environment, although that anti-Semitic racist one is a little bit problematic, to say the least. I think that people are looking to hire and get people who aren't just going to say, okay, because if that's the case, why do you have to hire people with brains? You want to hire people who are going to challenge in a healthy, respectful way.
Ron, is your hand up? You're still muted.
Now, am I clear?
Yes.
Okay. I think people have the right to speak and say whatever they please, but they should do with a filter. The thing that I've discovered with many programs I've been involved in, current events on Zoom classes, is people have some terrible views. There's one class I watch, and there's a couple of people who are so dramatically racist, it makes you sick. One said, "I don't like Zoom, it's owned by a Chinaman." Things like that really make you sick. I used to live next door to a German couple, and he was a wonderful man. He helped me whenever he could. We get into conversations from time to time when he would tell me that Hitler was only using those ovens because of infections amongst many Jewish people. So what do I do?
Right.
I have to live next door to the man. What I do is I would challenge his message, but never challenge him.
Yeah.
I never said, I don't like what you're saying. But I would talk about what he had said, but I never characterized his speech with his personality or his wife's, who sometimes was as equally bad. You're never going to change their minds most of the time. I mean, I think about our former president who does exactly that. He's constantly attacking the messenger. Look what he did just the other day with Bill Barr because he didn't like Bill's comment. So I think you must speak with a filter. You must attack the message, but not the messenger, and be respectful of his view, even if you don't like it. Thank you.
Look, I mean, I won't ask for a show of hands, but are there friendships that you had that ended because you were really angry at somebody for something that they did, but you never told them because you just didn't know how? So it was easier to just let the relationship, fade away. I mean, this, as I said, I don't know if I would advise trying this at home. Or maybe you need, that's why people go to mediators and therapists, and because sometimes it's so hard to say those things and it's so hard to hear those things, that sometimes that's why people need a professional to help them communicate in that way. But the Torah is really worried that if you are in think about living in a really small town, and you are with the same people all day, every day, and these are the only people you're going to see. You're not moving away. People grew, unless there was a reason you had to flee, people barely left, stayed in the same town they were in forever and never traveled really very far. And this was it. This was the whole group of people. You didn't get anybody else. And so if you had those feelings, if somebody hurt you or somebody did something, you were offended, and you could start to hate somebody. It's not that hard. And so the Torah is trying to figure out a way that you express yourself, you express what it is, you tell them so that you don't hate them. And that you don't, and then of course, hate, it's more than just hate. You could hate them and then you want to take vengeance. Right? It's not just enough that you hate them quietly. Now you just don't hate them, you want to harm them. And so these processed feelings can lead to very bad and dangerous behavior. So in the ideal world, when you are part of a covenantal community, there was a band from, I want to say the 80s.
Yeah, I really have trouble with this. I think if you rebuke your neighbor, it's not the message you're looking at. You're looking at the neighbor. So you're not dealing with what he's feeling or what he's saying. You're dealing with him personally.
Right.
It seems to me that this is inconsistent with not hating your neighbor. You're displaying hate, though, when you rebuke him.
You know, I have to look at what all the commentators say about the word rebuke. My best bet is they soften it way up, right? Like, you know, you kindly mention, you know, while you're getting around to it, if you could keep your dog off my lawn, I would, you know, whatever it is. But the word rebuke is very harsh, and that for sure is not going to work. You know,
I
that
had a neighbor who I wasn't getting along with. And right after your sermon about how we should go to our neighbors and make up and try to get along with them, I walked over to my neighbor's house and I knocked on his door after the services. And I said, Dennis, we've got to get over this. He slammed the door, almost broke my fingers.
Oy,
Then he came out and he smacked me in the mouth and I had to have him arrested.
don't
So,
listen to my sermons.
you know, what I'm saying is you
That's
just have to be
horrible.
careful with what you do. But when you rebuke your neighbor, you're not dealing with his message, is my point.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna look see what the commentators say about the word rebuke, because I think because rebuke is easy to see why that's a bad idea. Like rebuking your spouse, rebuking your best friend, like rebuke is you know, the chances of anybody being able to hear that.
I just looked it up in the dictionary before we spoke because I was having this conflict. And it's a very sharp, it means a very sharp anger
Yeah.
at your,
But I feel like I want to know more about the Hebrew.
yeah, maybe
I
the.
want to know more about the Hebrew. The Hebrew could be
Not so
sharper.
good.
Okay, one more source. This actually happened in my life, I have to say. Never thought in a million years this source would be relevant. So, take care of the needy. Try not to hate your neighbor by expressing yourself. And yet, in Exodus, if you encounter your enemy's ox. So let's just stop there for a minute. All of these aspirational covenantal values, it's like we start out, if there be needy amongst you, there will always be needy amongst you, right? You're all created in the image of God. You all love each other, but somehow you still have an enemy, right? So even in the best case scenario where everybody's trying to, you know, act kindly and nicely to each other, and maybe you rebuke too harshly and now you have an enemy, you still have to live in a society with these people, and therefore you still have a certain way that you are obligated to behave. So if you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering, you shall surely bring it back to your enemy, right? So an animal gets out, you're walking down the road, you see this loose animal, it's got some sort of marking that you realize it belongs to somebody that you really hate. You got to bring it back to them, right? This is about, you know, in Judaism, we talk a lot about, it's not about feelings, it's about actions. Nobody says this anymore, but when I was a young rabbi, people used to say all the time, I feel Jewish in my heart. I'm told that Rabbi Frankel called that cardiac Judaism. I feel Jewish in my heart. I don't hear anybody actually use that phrase, which is good. I think it fell out of popular usage because you can't. Judaism isn't actually about what you feel in your heart. Judaism is actually about your actions and your deeds and what you do. You know, of course, you're Jewish no matter what. It's like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. So even if you don't do anything Jewish, you're still Jewish. But Judaism is a religion that is based on how you act and the deeds that you do. So you may, after all of this, still hate your neighbor, still they're your enemy. And even so, you have a covenantal obligation if their animal is wandering to bring it back to them. If you see the donkey of the person who hates you, so not only you hate them, they hate you, lying under its burden. So they're, you know, and they load animals with things that they needed moved from place to place. And sometimes they overloaded it and the animal collapsed under the heaviness of the burden. And then you have to help pick up this animal, which has got to be awfully difficult. So if you see that happen, you shall not leave without helping them. You shall surely release it with them. So no matter how you feel about each other, there are certain ways that you need to act. So I tell the story on when I've taught this, that many years ago now, we had new neighbors that moved in next door to us. And they sued us over the property dispute of where the boundary of our properties were. Which was, not very particularly nice because our house has been in Dan's family since 1959. So it was a bit of a big shockaroo and not a particularly nice thing, and expensive and unpleasant. And about 2 years into this, they were renovating the house and they were getting ready to move in. And lo and behold, their dog wandered into our yard. And believe me, there was a part of me that was like, wander on. There was a part of me that was like, what if I put the dog in the car and drove it out to a forest preserve somewhere and nobody ever saw it? I mean, these thoughts went through my head, but I know Torah. And I knew that this was actually a mitzvah that I never thought in my wildest imagination I would have the opportunity to fulfill. Took the stupid dog, put it in the one area of my yard that's fenced in, called this neighbor, left them a message, like, I have your dog. No, not I have your dog, but like, I have your dog. And if you'd like to send somebody over to pick it up. And they did. Now, I think it maybe is a coincidence that we ended up settling actually the lawsuit very soon after that. I'd like to think it was because they realized that they were going to now be moving in and we were actually going to be neighbors. And after all, I did save their dog. So we're not chatty neighbors. We have a big yards and a big fence, but on occasion we see each other out of the mailbox. We nod hello. But it is, so it didn't have it's not like we're like best friends and now we have, dinner together on a regular basis. I get along really well with my other neighbors. But the idea is that there are ways that neighborly people, hopefully, God forbid, your neighbor never that was probably the sermon I gave, and poor Ron listened to me and went over and tried to make nice to his neighbor. But there are ways that one is obligated to act in society, regardless of how you feel about somebody. You still have to behave in a proper way towards them. Probably an election, calling people deplorables is, not gonna win you any votes or make you particularly popular. So there are certain ways that one is supposed to act regardless of how you feel. And you're supposed to rise to that occasion. So these are the ways, these are just some of the ways. There are many, many more, of course, but these are just some of the broad ways that Judaism thinks about how we create a community that cares for one another. And even if we don't like one another, how we still create a society that's civil and that we can live in and that we can be part of, and not worry that, somebody's going to actually drive your dog to a forest preserve, never to be seen again. So as I said, there are many, many more sources, but this is sort of just a taste. So I'll just end there. If people have other things they'd like to say or ask.
I'm just going to say, I know you said Judaism is a religion of action, but I will tell you, in one of my many yoga classes, we do talk about, we say certain mantras and they're, kindness, and we are often asked to think of someone who you do not have these feelings toward. And I got to tell you, Ron, it's safer than what you did, which I think is very a wonderful thing. But, and I think sometimes that's a start. And if you can do that, it also frees you. It's healthier. Then you can get rid of it.
Something I'm really trying to do personally, particularly before the next election cycle, and maybe because now we're past Trump long enough that I can do this, is to really say to myself, why does the other side think this way? It can't just be because they're crazy and they're evil and they're deplorable and they're terrible. And I don't even think anymore that's just because they're going to bad news sources, because frankly, I think I'm going to bad news sources. I think we're all going to news sources that, have certain ways of and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, because it's an easy example, is this bill in Florida that they're calling the Don't Say Gay bill. So I wanted to read the text of the bill. What does the text of the bill actually say? So the text of the bill actually says that you can't talk to young children in primary school about gender, and that if teachers hear something, they have to tell the parents, unless they feel that it could put the child in danger. Now, obviously, people enact laws that they think are good intention laws, and then very bad things happen. That, of course, can be true on the left and on the right. But I'm just like, is it? And it maybe I, think it's a bad law. I don't think it's a law that should be passed. But is it evil that parents feel like if a teacher knows something about their kid, that the parent should know? Like, it's not, is it evil to say that, like, maybe I don't want my young child to hear about these things yet? It may end up again having bad effect, blah, blah, blah. But I'm just getting really tired of assuming that the other side is just evil. And I'm really trying to practice stopping before I do that and saying, well, what's their case? What's their case? And could they possibly have some points that actually are not unreasonable? And, I don't, it's not easy. It's not easy. Our society's kind of lost that ability. But I do feel like,
limited, just the legislation was limited to just the third grade.
right, that's what they're saying, that it's only up to the third grade. So maybe, kids that are younger than the third grade don't really need to be talking about gender identity. But I hope that a teacher can say Billy has 2 daddies. Like, we don't know where the line is drawn, and that's why it could be problematic. Like, if you say Billy has 2 daddies, are you gonna get in trouble for that? But and is this even the role of a teacher to be speaking about these things? I mean, not Billy's daddies, yes, but is it the role of your your elementary school teacher to be talking about these things? I don't know. Like, I don't know. I think probably not, would be my preference. So so that's the hope. I mean, it's just one example. It's harder to do with abortion. I've got other, like, there are other things. I picked one that was easy. There are ones that are much, 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 much harder for me. But I'm really trying to ask myself that question more. And I'm trying to ask myself the question about, if I just assume that the bill is don't say gay, but I haven't actually even read the bill. Am I just as guilty as the other side that is getting their news filtered without looking at a primary source? So, and I would say yes, which Donna sent me a good, what's it called? Tangle? What's it? Tangle? That has, like, they just talked about it today. That's why it's on my mind, right?
Yeah.
Here's what the one side says. Here's what the other side says. Here's my opinion. And I kind of like the way it's laid out. So you kind of get an idea, like, well, what does the other side say,
Wait, is Tangle and separate than the flip side?
Yeah, it's different. It's a guy named Saul. I can't think of his last name right now. Grew up in the conservative movement.
Okay. Thanks.
So anyways, I think that, this idea, and this idea of what we owe each other, and it's hard to have, we've got a big Jewish world. We have our feelings about how we support Israel, but part of it is, also a lot about the synagogue community that we want to create. Like, we can't, we no longer live in a shtetl where all of our neighbors are Jewish and everybody that we know is Jewish. But we do have a synagogue community that we, try to create. It's been hard during COVID, but a community that cares for one another. We do have a chesed community, so that if somebody needs help with something, it's been a little dormant during COVID because it's been hard to interact with people. This week, people are going out to deliver mishloach manot for the first time in our community. And this idea of how do you take this community and create it as a covenantal community of people who care for one another. And so, we at the synagogue, we think about that a lot. It's a community where not everybody knows each other, where a lot of people don't know each other, and we're somewhat siloed. So we have we think about that a lot. So anybody else?
I would like to just make a statement. In my view, the material and topics that we focused on tonight are the primary reasons for Judaism. I think there is nothing more important than the rules of Judaism, which lay down the parameters of people living with some civility.
Right.
And God help us if we forget that.
Yeah, I think for many of us, there were many things that were difficult about the last administration. And some of them were really serious policy disagreements. But what was so painful was seeing the norms of how a president should speak and always has go out the window, and hearing cruelty and mocking and bullying out of the mouth of the president.
Insults and humility.
Right, like we had really never seen such a thing. And so for us to see it and wonder about the norms of society and civility, and to wonder how other people could look at this and not care or think it was funny or even like it, you know, or seeing what happened last week during the State of the Union when the two congresswomen were you know, yelling out during the State of the Union. At least a few Republicans tried to silence them. Like, we had certain norms of civil behavior that that we expected from our, you know, from our public figures, and it was very painful to watch that and wonder what was happening and how was that role model, you know, for our children, and, you know, telling them they can't be bullies, and then, you know, seeing that. So you know, it may come back, we don't know. But in any case, thinking about, and it's hard, I really couldn't do it for 4 years, and I don't think I could do it for the first year and a half after the administration. But now I think I'm in a place where I can think a little bit more about, you know, how do we think about healing our society and closing some of those divides. Right before Trump was elected, I think the summer before he was elected, I went on a listening trip through a group called Encounter in Israel to go visit with Palestinians and listen to their narrative, and not to argue and not to, you know, but just to listen. And some of it was really hard to listen to, you know, defending suicide bombers as heroes and freedom fighters. It was really, really hard. And when I got back and Trump was elected, I thought about if somebody invited me to go to a listening trip to Alabama to hear about why they voted for, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And what was the difference? Why could I? Maybe because it wasn't my, you know, maybe because I'm removed from the society a little bit more with Israel, but why could I listen to such painful narratives from the Palestinians and was not able to listen to the narrative of certain Republicans? And so I'm trying to think about, I couldn't think about that for a long, long time, but I am trying to think about it more now in this lull, in this lull. All right, everybody else. Yes,
Yeah,
Donna.
I have one other thing, and I know it's time to go. Just, I'm just noticing how much we're saying listening. It started with Deanna telling us how she convinced people to change their minds about the vaccine. You've brought up, several of us have brought it up. It's about there's a lot of listening involved. So I don't know what the Torah has to say about that, but it's kind of seems to connect.
Well, I will say, I always say that I think the primary mitzvah, the primary of all this, one of the sense of the five senses that you experience Torah through is Shema, is to listen or to hear. In the Torah, seeing is not believing. There's a lot of stuff about not trusting your eyes. And believe it or not, it's not taste, even though Jews and food, but you learn through hearing. And Judaism was an oral tradition. Like, they didn't have written books. So of course it may, you know, it wasn't that it was so cosmic. It was, that's the only way you could learn something was to listen. And that's how you learned it, because you couldn't read it in a book. But the idea of listening and hearing, that's how you were supposed to experience God. So it is something that's profoundly important, even as difficult and as challenging as it is. All right, everyone, have a lovely week, and we'll see each other hopefully in person very soon.